Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these. Hello, hello. In 1492, an estimated 140 million up to Native Americans were in the Americas, including North America. Okay. By 1600, 108 years later, the claimed reduction is 15 million. So 140 million to 15 million. The dominant narrative is that old world diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza killed 80 to 90% of the indigenous population because they had no immunity to these pathogens. Supposedly, Europeans were carriers, but not equally susceptible because they had centuries of exposure to zoonotic plagues. There is no possible way that this is true, and I want to prove it. But first, let me welcome people to the show. First one here, Adric Hapoy. He says it's on. Thank you for being here. Leon is here. What up to you as well? Adrian says, let's go. Thank God there wasn't a breath in the middle. Thanks for being here. He says, we're going to see where all the engines went. Look in the mirror. Cynical Optimist is here. Peace to you as well. Andrea is here. Hi to you as well. And Adrian is saying hello. Everybody's saying hello to people. Thank you, Spain man. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the support. Today is going to be a big one. So I definitely appreciate the support. I have done a ton of research. This is going to be a long one. And the whole second half is a tinfoil hat where we're really going to get into it. And it's going to be a little mind-blowing. And you might hear some stuff you've never really put together before. Maybe. So again, I really appreciate the support. This is going to be a long show today. Adric says, let's hear it for the Dancing Maggies. Deb the Apostle is here, coming to learn. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody. And for those watching from the clouds, feel free to say hello. This is the best live tribe on YouTube, bar none. If you come in, people will say hello. They'll be really welcoming as long as you're appropriate. Don't say anything weird or gross or, sexual, especially when we're talking about what we're talking about. And shout out to the replay gang. Thank you, Deb the Apostle. Thank you so much. Spain Man says, a long one? Yes. It's going to be long. And the tinfoil hat's going to be a thing. All right. So let's do some logical analysis. I do like a logical analysis. So birth rates. Over 178 years. Let's talk birth rates. If indigenous peoples continue to have children, and they did, nobody ever said, there's nowhere anywhere that says they stopped having children, then the number of actual deaths would have to exceed the simple difference between the two population figures, the up to 140 million down to around 15 million. Okay. It's way more than the 125 million that's on the surface. This is a logistical impossibility. Spain and Britain lacked the personnel, the infrastructure, and the logistics. You can look at all the logs and see how many people they brought, what they were doing, and they were on ships. And those ships, yes, had cannons, but they couldn't take the cannons into the middle of the New World. They didn't have the logistics to physically massacre 100+ million people across an entire continent. especially considering the terrain, the distances, and indigenous resistance. They had to have resisted. Somebody resisted. You know what I mean? This is total genocide denial, honestly, because there's history revision, hidden documents and proof, and no global reckoning. If they killed 125 million plus people, right? But they give you the disease narrative. Well, smallpox, right? Smallpox. That's always the thing. Disease supposedly, though, only went one way. Indigenous to European transfer is rarely ever mentioned unless they're talking about syphilis, which they brought the freaking syphilis. Okay. Europeans exposed to novel environmental factors in the New World didn't suffer any large scale fatalities. They were exposed to new things too, but they're fine. The native lifestyles were relatively clean and healthy, and they were spread out, which would naturally inhibit rabid disease transmission. And we learned that during COVID. COVID protocols attempted to replicate exactly how natives were living. Then they say, well, everyone they came upon, they slaughtered. Okay. If the first wave of settlers and conquistadors had massacred tribes, word would have spread. People talked. This would lead to more regional resistance, hiding, moving, all kinds of things. The idea that tribe after tribe was just super naive and dumb and just unsuspecting for over a century is just a weak argument. Very weak argument. Leon says, well, look what took place in South America even after World War I. Yeah, the cleansing of communism as capitalist disguise, those people as communist. Yeah. Live track today is going to be an extended version. Adrian says natives were allergic to bullets and European paperwork, especially when they were wearing slacks. Okay, so there's only a couple possible explanations. Okay. Oh, look at that. My slide doesn't look great. But there's only two really logical explanations. The first one is enslavement and forced assimilation. Okay. It is the classic conquest playbook. It is biblical warfare. It's what they've always done. This is in Numbers 31, Deuteronomy 20, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It affirms it. You kill the males of the fighting age, you enslave the rest of the males, and you marry or rape the women or kill them off, often resulting in forced assimilation. You see this in Spanish encomienda systems. You see this in British indentured and enslavement policies. You see this even with the capture and re-education of native children, the Iberian native children. So what logical reason would they pause the biblical playbook this one time? These are super Catholic people coming in with papal bulls telling them what they can do. They'd always used the biblical playbook. Why would they not do it this time? Well, they wouldn't pause it, right? And there is no document anywhere telling them to not use the tried and true method. So that's number one. Number two, a natural disaster. Okay, so potential candidates of natural disasters, comet and asteroid strikes. There was some from 1491 to 1520. There were some comet and asteroid strikes. Maybe a volcanic eruption. In 1452, Kauai eruption happened. There might have been some volcanoes going off in the Americas. Again, no documentation for it. And maybe some environmental destabilization, mega droughts or earthquakes or flooding. But again, you bring up flooding during that time, and they will tell you that you're a conspiracy theorist and you're crazy, which always makes me go, oh, well, then I definitely need to look at that. So we're going to look at that during the tinfoil hat section. Okay, so native oral histories tell you about sky fire, floods, and sickness following the stars falling. Maybe this is the asteroid event. So, if we take those two things, the colonial enslavement and forced assimilation, with a natural disaster, and then add in their deliberate biowarfare, where they weaponize disease for some people, you can see where we start to get to these numbers. There is clear evidence that biowarfare did happen. You remember the infamous smallpox blankets at Fort Pitt in 1763? It is feasible earlier actors could have experimented with similar methods, intentionally or unintentionally, but there's no documentation of that. They could have brought infested livestock or livestock that got sick on the ships. Maybe that happened. Maybe they targeted communal food or water sources. Wait a minute. Then they'd have to admit there were communal water sources and it wasn't just the wild, wild west everywhere. Maybe they incited intertribal conflict through resource destabilization. But again, there's no documentation of this. And we can look at suppressed archaeological evidence of massive kill zones and burned settlements. They don't want you to talk about those. There are many mound sites, burned villages, and mass graves in North America whose explanations are vague or just missing entirely. The Smithsonian, the British Museum, and other institutions have long been accused of removing or hiding evidence of large, complex indigenous civilizations that predated and rivaled early Europe. This could just as easily be massive death by catastrophe in these mounds, which would increase the likelihood of conquering. Okay, so some pre-Columbian societies were already in decline. The Mississippian culture, the Cahokia, had collapsed or fragmented before European contact, possibly due to internal source depletion, wars, natural catastrophe. Don't know. Although that alone wouldn't explain a continent-wide die-off of millions of people. So let's talk about the immunity lie. Let's get a little deeper. Before I do, there's lots of comments. Let me see what people are saying. Cynical says, during the transitional period from 1650 to 1750, Africans and Native Americans shared the common experience of enslavement. Well, and you also had some native tribes who owned enslaved Black people as well. And that is documented. So let's talk about the immunity lie. Okay. The mainstream claim, what they will tell you is Europeans had centuries of exposure to diseases like smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, those things. As a result, they became immune, or they were at least asymptomatic carriers, passing deadly germs to native populations who lacked that immunity. But our modern logic, especially what we learned during COVID, no one is immune. Even natural immunity is doubted, right? We're told asymptomatic spread is dangerous, so everyone has to be vaccinated, masked, isolated, and restricted. And healthy carriers are dangerous, period. And they also said these immune people are very, very rare. So how do we square that with the claim that millions of Europeans carried deadly plagues across an ocean and none of them had symptoms? None of them? Spreading it like a one-way death wave while remaining totally fine themselves. They didn't catch the smallpox, but everybody in Europe had smallpox. But all these people who were on ships didn't get smallpox. We can't square that. It's a myth built on faulty logic, right? Even immune people still get sick sometimes. If smallpox killed millions of natives, the same virus should have at least really sickened and definitely killed many Europeans, especially as it mutated in a new environment. It is in a new ecosystem. Should have killed off the Europeans too. But we see no reports of massive death in the early colonialists. No millions died off from a new form of smallpox. And this is all the stuff we learned from COVID. Oops. Now let's add to that the colonists were not sanitary, okay? Natives bathed regularly, lived off the land, rotated their hunting zones, and maintained herbal medicine systems. Europeans, on the other hand, especially during those long sea voyages and the rough early settlements, were filthy, malnourished, and riddled with lice, rats, and human waste. If disease was that powerful to kill off millions of the very healthy people, it should have ravaged at least both populations or ravaged the Europeans first. They were weakened. And what they tell you doesn't square with how viruses actually travel. You can't drop one smallpox patient into a continent and expect a 90% die off unless, thank you so much, Adrian. Yeah. Why are you hitting yourself? You killed yourselves, right? So you can't drop one smallpox patient into a continent and get a 90% die off unless you're talking about massive simultaneous exposure. So widespread dropping one person across the entire continent. Again, they did not have the infrastructure for that, right? Maybe it was deliberate biowarfare, but it'd have to be simultaneous. Again, they did not have the infrastructure. What about environmental triggers? What if there was a natural catastrophe that created weakened immune systems after a famine or some kind of trauma? Maybe, but these Europeans just were starving and filthy and gross in the damn boat. Their immune system was down as well. Maybe it was a completely different phenomenon altogether, targeted mass killing, but they didn't have the infrastructure, right? They didn't have the infrastructure for any of that, okay? Real immunology 101, right? And we learned all this from COVID. You're not protected without active immunizations, even if your ancestors survived past plagues. So these Europeans, it could not have been one way. They should have died. Asymptomatic spreaders are biohazards, and they would have spread smallpox across the entire ship, right? One unvaccinated person can supposedly cause an outbreak. Yet somehow, entire shiploads of smallpox exposed Europeans walked into a new world and stayed alive while an entire continent dropped dead. That is not science. That is colonial cover story. So it's not about immunity. It's about justifying conquest. The virgin soil epidemic narrative makes genocide seem accidental. Well, we didn't mean to. We had smallpox, right? It avoids blame, and it paints Europeans as unfortunate bringers of doom, not murderers, slavers, and thieves. Let's expose the core truth here. If disease was that contagious and deadly, colonists would have died too, period. And since they didn't, something else must explain the demographic collapse of Native America. Adrian says, shout out to European settlers, the OGs of improvised weapons. And they must have had the funkiest. I mean, they had to have been nasty. Okay. So let's get into it. Okay. Colonizers equated phenotype, dark skin, broad nose, woolly hair, with African, regardless of actual ancestry or location. And it's done time and time and time again. They brought their own lens of racial classifications with them. It ignored the actual tribal, linguistic, and geographic identities of all the people they encountered. It wasn't a mistake. It was a system of reclassification to enable slavery and erasure. So let's talk facts. Dark-skinned indigenous peoples were labeled African by default. Spanish, British, and Portuguese racial taxonomies were based on phenotype, not actual origin. Any dark-skinned person they encountered was classified, and this is in their documents, they were classified as either African, which meant they were open to be enslaved, or Indian, if they were submissive, compliant, and were a little lighter and had straight hair. Many early explorers wrote about, quote, Negroes found in the Americas before the enslavement of Africans began. So let's look at a quote from Bartolomé de las Casas. This is a Spanish priest from the 1500s. He says, the people of the Indies, which again, remember, that's where they thought they were. The people of the Indies are very simple and do not know evil. Their color is the color of a dark Canary Islander or a Moor. Now, I don't want to get into and prove how Moor means black people. You can find that everywhere. It is easily found. But, if I have a bunch of disbelievers, we can get into it. But Moor means black. So the translation of that is they were black and they were native, right? Now, the churches, so this is the explorers, right? They brought their own racial taxonomies with them about phenotype. Phenotype just means how they looked. Do you look African? Then you're African. Then you're a, quote, Negro, okay? If you don't look like you're from Africa, then you are an Indian because they thought they were in the Indies, the West Indies, okay? So let's talk the church. The church's distinction between Indian and African justified enslavement by that very classification. The Catholic Church, via papal bulls, which means like an edict, like where a papal bull is like a directive from the Pope. So papal bulls like Sublimis Deus in 1537 said Indians were human and should not be enslaved. But they made no such decree for Africans or, quote, Negroes, who had already been targeted in papal bulls like the Dum Diversas in 1452, long before Christopher Colon came and all the other Spanish conquistadors, right? 1452. They were already targeted. The Pope said, you can enslave Africans, right? And the Romanus Pontifex of 1455, allowing Portugal to enslave Saracens, pagans, and infidels. Now, what were Africans called? Pagans. Okay, so if someone looked African, regardless of being native to the Americas, colonizers had a huge incentive to call them African. That way they could legally enslave them. They could avoid violating church doctrine and making God mad, and it would erase their claim to the indigenous statues, right? Because there was treaties going on with certain people. Let's see. Tenochtitlan or Aztec, what happened with them? We're going to talk about the Mayans. Cynical says, if memory serves me correctly, Giovanni de Verrazzano in 1524 documented that arriving on the Carolina coast, people were said to be of dark color, not much unlike the Ethiopians. I like that. And we're going to look at some writings. And the doctrine of discovery, thank you, Adrian, in 1453. So there is a huge incentive. Now, again, I'm going to harken back to why would they stop the biblical playbook of overtaking the powers that be and enslaving the men of the powers? That's how you conquer. So we have that playbook. The disease narrative is a lie. And they were incentivized to say that people who looked African were African because this really bolsters up who they can enslave to help them conquer the new world. Okay, so let's talk about the all natives come from Asia myth. Okay, not all natives, but it does support the reclassification. Okay, now look at this 2025 Native American Conference. What do you see? Do you see what I see? Do you see what I see? So, the all natives come from Asia myth is parroted as fact. And what it states is that all Native Americans are descended from Siberian migrants via the Bering Strait, which is the land bridge theory. Okay. Therefore, they should have Asian features, including straight black hair, epicanthic fold, that's how their eyes are shaped, and lighter skin than Black people. So, what happens when they find dark skinned people with woolly hair and broad noses? Well, they're labeled African because they look African to these explorers. They don't look native, okay? Even if their DNA, their language, their oral history shows that they are native to that land, they are indigenous. But here's the kicker: ancient mound builder skeletons and South American remains show Negroid features. There are mounds all over North America. The Olmecs, the pre-Maya, so we'll talk about them, carved massive heads with clear African features. The Zuni and Washita tribes tell oral stories of Black ancestry rooted in the Americas long before Christopher Colon came. So let's look at some research. Let me pull this up. Oh, let me see what Adrian says. Tangentially, this makes me think about how and why the settlers would make agreements with lighter skinned native tribes to capture Black slaves. Maybe those Black folks were just other native tribes. Definitely something to look at. Okay, I'm going to pull up this book. There it is. This book here, and you can preview it on Google Books. I only need the preview because the preview is several hundred pages. But I want to buy this book. This is yet another book I really want to buy. How sad is it? It's always these books that I want to buy. There's another book I want to buy that's $1,200. So, that's way on the back burner. But this is a Harvard book. This is quoted. The archaeologists, historians always say this is an amazing book and leads to a bunch of information about the Americas. Nobody says this book is false. Therefore, we can believe what's in here. Again, it's a Harvard book. It's called Researches, Philosophical and Antiquarian Concerning the Aboriginal History of America. Okay, so, and then this is published in 1829. Now, unfortunately, you saw as I kind of zoomed past, the maps aren't really showing. Okay, but there is a map. This goes from California all the way across into Florida, right? And it's the route of this explorer, okay, Ferdinand de Soto, and that's in about 1539. Okay, so pretty early, right? We see here Harvard College Library. Okay, so we are going to go to page 25. Let's read some stuff. Sorry, guys, don't stare at the pages. I'm flipping fast. I don't want anybody to have a seizure. All right, page 25. Okay. the authorities I have been able to examine respecting the present Negro appearance of the Indians in that region are as follows. Okay, so between the rivers Columbia and Gila. Okay, the color of the Indians of the Californian, this is not South America, guys, this is not Central America, Californian missions seen by La Perouse, and that there's the resource right there, quote, very nearly approaches that of the Negroes whose hair is not woolly. And in another place, the, quote, color of these Indians, which is that of Negroes. Well, we're starting there, right? So Langsdorff, who visited San Francisco on the coast of California, again, this is not South America, confirms the observations of La Perouse, for he says the Indians there, quote, are of a very dark complexion approaching to black. They have large projecting lips and broad, flat, Negro-like noses. Indeed, many of their features, as well as their physiognomy and almost their color, bear a strong resemblance to the Negroes. Their hair, however, is long and straight. Okay, so then they compare them to Hindu blacks and say how they are different. All right, let's go to page 28. 28. The American Indians, compared with Europeans, have but little beard, and it is almost universally their practice to eradicate it, as well as all other hair from their bodies. Some even plucked out their eyebrows and eyelashes, as was pretty commonly the case with the natives of Brazil and Paraguay. Okay, it gives you resources there. This paucity of beard is not peculiar to the Americas. The Tartars and Malay tribes are equally deficient, as well as the African race. This is also now so well understood that it's unnecessary to notice it further. So they're even talking about hair on the body. But I want you to look at the Tartar tribe, because we're going to bring that up again in the tinfoil hat. Okay, page 31. And by the way, this book is like 600 pages long, and I'm only in the first 50 pages. So again, I need this book. Really want to go through it. Okay, now here's where it gets super interesting, guys. Our researches on the physical history of the Aborigines of America have not enabled us to add anything to the physiology history of man. Though they didn't find anybody new they hadn't seen before, is what they're saying. Though we have admitted that climate and states of civilization might occasion some partial modifications, yet neither as respects to their stature, their physiognomy, or complexion have we been able to discover any common principles by which we can explain the diversities that exist in the human family. Lots of diversity in North America, from California to Florida. The discovery certainly of a white race, and probably of one that is black in America, adjacent to each other and surrounded by brown men on all sides, becomes irreconcilable with any theory that supposes these different complexions to be consequent on physical causes. And when we, let me move that, connect these American anomalies with the existence of brown men in Africa and black men in the islands of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, who yet live under the same solar influence and with similar uncivilized institutions, we feel more and more reluctant to admit that these diversities have originated from partial causes. Men divided into white, brown, and black have existed from the earliest times of history, and they have, least to our knowledge, continued in those relative states without ever departing from their established characters. The observation of Humboldt, it would seem, is absolutely correct, who remarks, that notwithstanding the variety of climates and elevations inhabited by the different races of men, nature never deviates from the models of which she made selection thousands of years ago. Now, I have already done a show on this. There are two different kinds of white people, right? There's a certain kind of white people who came from the land, and those that sort of sprung, the Neanderthals, right? The Neanderthals sprung white. In this book, they talk about the Neanderthal tribe. They don't call them Neanderthals, but they are big, they are bully, they are warlike, and cannibals. All of the things that we've been told by archaeologists, exactly the Neanderthals. Oh, and they had white skin, right? The other kind of pale is it's a mutation. That's the other white people that happened, is the mutation. And the unfortunate thing is most white people don't know the difference. Okay, let's keep going. Page 22. Okay, page 22. Again, talking about the different tribes, okay? Now, this is in Guyana, okay? Especially near the sources of the Orinoco, are several tribes of a whitish complexion. The Guayacas, Guararibes, and Arigues, of whom several robust individuals exhibiting no symptoms of astenical malady, that mutation, which characterizes albino, oh, I'm sorry, they meant albino, have the appearance of true mestizos. Okay, this is a mestizo is like a mixed, is what they're talking about. Yet these tribes have never mingled with Europeans and are surrounded with other tribes of a dark brown hue. So again, the Americas were very diverse. There were white tribes. There were people called moon people who were an albino tribe. There were black tribes. And there were the Siberian tribes. Okay, let's go back to, oh my goodness, comments. Sorry. Leon says, reminds me of Chief Bubba. He was in a Native American video. He's white as white can be. Yeah, that picture. Hi, JB Designs. Thanks for being here. Leon said old pics have shown a few Neanderthals with brown skin, but most likely they were dirty, or they could have been mixed. I mean, there were stories about Neanderthal tribes during massacres raping people. So that could have very definitely been a part of that. Okay, I'm going to pull this back up. Okay, back to those for the white people. Okay. Oh, let me go through that super fast. Sorry. Okay. So that gives you some background information. So let's talk paper genocide and the erasure of Black natives. Get this pulled in here. Okay. Throughout history, we've seen this time and time again, Black natives were renamed, relabeled, and erased from tribal roles. The U.S. Dawes rolls classified dark-skinned Native Americans as freedmen. Not Native Americans, not Indians, but freedmen. They also labeled dark-skinned Native Americans as Negro, not Indian, even when they had full tribal lineage. By the 1800s, federal policy, this is the law, actively redefined who counted as Native based on blood quantum and phenotype, how you looked. If you looked Black, that's it, which was disenfranchising to the darker Native tribes. This was intentional erasure and part of a larger colonial project to steal the land, control the bodies, and rewrite the history. So let's talk logic. Can we talk a little bit of logic? I mean, if we can. Okay. Colonists saw dark skin and assumed African, not Indian. They brought their own taxonomies, okay? The church said, don't enslave the Indians, but you can enslave the Africans. So, to enslave indigenous people with African features, they simply labeled them as African. Modern science reinforces this deception. Look, Asian. So the result is the true diversity of the indigenous population, especially Black indigenous peoples, was buried under layers of race science, eugenics, church policy, colonial law, and academic whitewashing. I'm going to put this up here. You guys can screenshot that or take a moment to read it if you want to. Because conquest always follows a pattern. Always has, and has since then. Again, there was no reason to treat North America different than every other conquest that happened. The pattern: conquer the men in power, either by killing them or enslaving them as labor or for soldiers. Claim or kill the women through marriage, rape, murder, or forced assimilation to produce hybrid offspring loyal to the conquerors. This has been the method of empire from Babylon to Rome to Islam to Christendom, and it is explicitly described in the Bible. So, why would Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France, all biblically trained imperialists who are using the Bible as an excuse to do what they're doing, behave any different, but only in North America? It doesn't make any sense, and they wouldn't. The transatlantic slave trade narrative is logistically impossible as it's presented. Okay, I'm not saying it didn't happen. Don't think I'm not saying that. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. And most of it is because the transport numbers have always been in question. So many people question the transport numbers. Some people to the point of saying there's never been anything called a slave ship. Well, there was cargo ships, so I don't necessarily go in with that. But the numbers just don't seem correct. Okay? And so this is what I'm thinking. Okay? Let me lay it out. It is claimed that 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, but fewer than 400,000 arrived in what is called the United States out of that 12.5 million. So 400,000 came to later United States. The rest were sent to Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay. Yet somehow a Black population in the US exploded into tens of millions by the late 1800s. Despite horrific conditions, high mortality rates, low birth rates, infant mortality rates, all up until forced breeding. So it's not like I'm not going to leave that out. Okay. But all of that only makes sense if many of those who are classified as African were already here. Now, go back to what I said in the beginning. Tens of millions died. 125 million died. Of course, some died. Of course, there was wars, right? But isn't it interesting that the number of Native Americans in North America was steady going down by the hundreds of thousands, while the number of enslaved Africans was steady going up by the hundreds of thousands? And yet they only brought 400,000. And they only started forced breeding after it was outlawed to bring more people in. Okay. So see how it's makes me question. Okay. All of that only makes sense if many of those classified as African were already here and were relabeled. The slave population had to include conquered indigenous peoples with dark skin who were mislabeled for labor control so that they could be enslaved. The early enslaved population was predominantly, if not mostly all, male. If you look at the Conquer, the Conquer playbook that's in the Bible, of course, all of the enslaved people would be male. That's the playbook, right? But early records show male heavy enslaved populations, if not all, especially in the 1500s to the 1600s. This disproves the idea of generational growth by natural birth in the early slave era. There weren't females to do it, okay? Forced breeding farms didn't start until the late 1700s into the 1800s. Well, actually, I think it was 1809 to 1865. And it was after the transatlantic slave trade was legally banned that obviously it wasn't fully stopped. So again, for the Black population to already be growing and numerous, the bulk of it had to already be here. Or it just seems like the narrative is mathematically impossible, especially when you look at the native population is going down by hundreds of thousands at a clip, and the population of enslaved Africans is going up at hundreds of thousands at a clip. Senegal says intermarriage of Africans and Native Americans was facilitated by the disproportionate numbers of African male slaves to female and the decimation of Native American males by prolonged war, etc. And I'm sure those things happened, but it wasn't rampant. And again, when you look at like a 70% infant mortality rate, those babies weren't surviving to get hundreds of thousands at a clip until forced breeding was a huge boon. I'm not saying that didn't happen. And I'm not saying people weren't brought over. Obviously they were, especially if your primary bulk of your enslaved people are male and you're trying to conquer an entire continent and build all this stuff, and then they see all this stuff can grow and they want to make plantations, then you're going to have to bring in more. If you've already enslaved all of the indigenous people that you can because you relabeled them African, you're going to have to bring in more. And then when you're told you can't bring in anymore, then you start the forced breeding. And that's where we have African mixed with indigenous people who looked African to those early settlers. The church and crown needed Africans to justify slavery. Okay. As we discussed, the Catholic Church forbade enslaving Indians, but they allowed enslaving Africans. So Papal Bull Dum Diversus in 1452. Therefore, anyone dark-skinned and available for slavery, even if they were indigenous, really, was relabeled as African so that their bondage was legal under both canon and crown law. And they needed those people. Genetic and cultural traces support this, okay? DNA from many African Americans, or what we would call foundational Black Americans or American descendants of slavery, show high levels of Native American and Iberian ancestry, and it cannot be accounted for by post-slavery mixing. Many modern American Black families have oral histories of being indigenous, not African. And when I say many, it's a whole lot. It's most, okay? Tribes like the Yamasee, the Washita, which I brought up, and Blackfoot had Black members before African arrival, before the enslaved Africans arrived, many of whom were erased from tribal roles and reclassified as colored. By whom? The Europeans. The earliest explorers saw and documented the Black tribes. I just showed you that by that research book. Who is quoting people and he's giving you references. Okay? So to me, and I'm just putting this out here, we're just having a discussion. I wasn't there. I don't know. I'm just talking logic. To me, there are two conclusions, right? The Africans, the native people who looked Black were actually the conquered power of the region, right? It'd have to be that way. So they were already here, either as the dominant civilization or a confederation of powerful tribes, which it most likely, based on all the research, was a confederation of powerful tribes. These were dark skinned, woolly haired indigenous people whose power had to be broken by reclassification, enslavement, and religious conquest. Why do I say that? Because that's the biblical playbook. The people who don't fight you, i.e., the Native Americans that you signed treaties with and put on different lands, you don't have to enslave them. The white tribes who gave you no fight whatsoever and you completely assimilated them into who you are, you don't have to enslave them either. But the powerful families, the royal families, the military, those people that have power are the ones that you have to kill off. You have to do the biblical playbook. You got to kill off or marry the women, and you have to enslave the men. And you definitely have to kill off the royal family. That's always the biblical playbook. So the African-looking natives were the conquered power because of what actually happened. If we follow the biblical playbook, it looks like it played out. It would explain why Black people were and continue to be treated as enemies, not as equals or trading partners like they did with other tribes, always treated as enemies. Why they were massacred, not just colonized, why the Olmecs, the mound builders, and the Amazonian civilizations disappeared overnight. How did they disappear? Oh, they were just relabeled African and enslaved. Some Africans, yes, were imported to reinforce enslavement, like I said, to bolster the numbers of the enslaved workforce, right? To breed with the already enslaved indigenous men and some women, and to create an amalgamated Black class of laborers. Because the Europeans obviously could not tell the difference. And those people would have no legal land claims, no tribal identity, or sovereign status. Let me look and try to get some of these comments. Cynical says, yep, as well as the Yamasi and the Kickapoo. Yeah. Leon says, a lot of small hats have been saying that 20% of Blacks have some of their DNA. LOL. Common sense, it came down to the color of skin. Right. It's just how you look. Older pictures of Samoans are crazy and Hawaiians and a few others. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it would explain if we have this amalgamated Black class of laborers who are enslaved. It explains the sudden appearance of Black populations without clear African lineage, the erasure of darker skinned tribes from official Native records. They're just gone like they never happened. Why the US government created legal categories like Negro, colored, and freedmen was to sever their ancestral ties. These people are open and available for slavery. So let's talk examples. Again, this is just my theory that I'm throwing out, but I'm telling you why I think that way, just critically thinking about it, okay? The modern Maya, especially those still living in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras, bear a striking cultural and historical resemblance to the Garifuna people, not just in survival, but in how they were politically and racially reclassified, marginalized, and displaced. Okay, so who are the Garifuna? I don't know. Put your hand up in the chat if you have heard of the Garifuna. The Garifuna are an Afro-Indigenous people originally from the island of St. Vincent, Uruming, right? They are descended from West African people who were shipwrecked or escaped slavery and intermarried. Now, that is the common narrative. It had to have been West African people who were shipwrecked or who had escaped slavery. And, right, it couldn't have been native Black people, but they mixed in with the Carib, the Kalinago, and Arawak, who are the Taino indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. When the British conquered St. Vincent in the late 1700s, the Garifuna were labeled black. They were seen as a threat due to their military resistance. They were deported en masse to Central America into modern-day Honduras, Belize, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. They became stateless, landless, but they kept their culture intact, which was nice, maintaining indigenous spiritual systems, the African drumming and dance traditions, their own language, which is Arakan based with French and African influence, and strong ancestral identity tied to both the African and their native roots. But this mirrors the Maya experience. The British conquered St. Vincent. The Spanish conquered the Yucatan and the Payten, right? Then we have reclassification from free people to black or black Caribs to Africans. And then the Mayans are relabeled from Mayan nation to Indios to Ladino peasants. Right? The Garifuna were deported to Central America from where they had been for thousands of years. The Mayan were relocated into encomiendas and rural settlements. Language and identity were suppressed. The Mayan writing system was destroyed. Destroyed. They spent 30 days, by the way, burning all the Mayan books. Their culture was outlawed, right? They survived through culture, language, music, ancestor, ritual, language, dress, oral tradition persists even when the language is gone, right? They were ignored as a civilization, right? They're just folk. They're just tribal, but these are just Black people. They were erased as the builders of civilizations, of pyramids, and of cities. Adrian says it's more like small hats have some of our DNA, probably. Adrian says, I know some personally. Leon says, what's crazy to me is the clothing, attire, tattoos, dots, art, etc. of South Americans and West Africa. LOL. The only thing different is the hair and the richness of their colors due to the types of plants. Ooh, remember that because I'm going to talk about purple. Leon says, my stepdad is from St. Vincent. Oh, that's cool. So the cultural truth is that just like the Garifuna, many modern Maya are descended from royal bloodlines, priests, engineers, astronomers, builders of civilizations, right? They may look or appear to others as being racially ambiguous, right? They look African or they look Asiatic, they look mixed or what we would call that, right? But they're classified politically to deny them land, power, and nationhood. So in both of those cases, empires saw to it that once powerful indigenous civilizations were absorbed into servant and labor castes, where their contributions to history could be completely forgotten. That comparison between the Garifuna and the Mayans opens up a path to decode other erased groups like Afro-Seminoles, Blackfoot and Yamasee, which we're just talking about, Chaco and Cuna peoples of Panama and Colombia, the Maroon and Palenque communities across the Americas. But the one I really want to talk about is the Nipmuc. Andrea said, this is why the Neanderthals in Brazil burned the National Museum in 2020. There was proof of all of this in there. Oh, and it's just sad to hear that. So let's talk about the Nipmuc. You can pronounce it Nipmuc, Nipmuc, various spellings, N-I-P-M-U-C-K, N-I-P-M-U-C, N-I-B-N-U-C-K, but that's kind of an archaic way. So they're from central Massachusetts, northern Rhode Island, and northeastern Connecticut. They are an Algonquin language closely related to neighboring tribes like the Massachusetts and the Mohegan. Their name, Nipmuc, roughly means freshwater people or people of small ponds and streams. Adrian says he is a Seminole freedman. And Cosmic Surfer says, yeah, so much deception in history. Absolutely. Um, their current status, the Nipmuc Nation is a state-recognized tribe in Massachusetts only. It continues to maintain cultural and community traditions. Do you see the people on your screen? These are the Nipmuc. It's a lot different than that Native American, the 2025 gathering picture that I showed you. It's quite a bit different, isn't it? But the Nipmuc are a case study in erased identity. They show you that this actually happened. This is an example of being changed from an Indian, what they called them, to being colored, to being black, to being open to slavery. Okay. In 1860 census, the Nipmuc were called Indian. Okay. Many Nipmuc people were listed in the census as Indian, still acknowledged as a tribal people despite centuries of colonization. Okay. So they maintained it for a lot longer than other people. Of course, they're up in the north, right? In 1870, they were labeled colored, and some were labeled Negro. Just 10 years difference, 1860 to 1870. It's the same people, right? Just 10 years later, many of those individuals were classified as colored or Negro, meaning black, right? That's what colored means under the post-Civil War racial codes. That's what colored means. This wasn't accidental. It was part of a broader effort to eliminate tribal land claims, fold native populations into the black racial category, and prevent future generations from claiming indigenous sovereignty. So, why did it happen? We can talk about that. Sorry, there's Adrian says, you should see the Choctaw tribes these days, complete with their casinos and military contracts. Lily White. Andrea says, I'm Muskogee and Yamasee, classified as Negroid at birth, Negro of indeterminate descent. Oh, here we go with the indeterminate descent, right? Where they're like, they don't want to say. We don't know. Nuts. Okay, so the Nipmuc, why it happened. Well, we had the blood quantum laws and the one drop rules, and because people can't tell the difference between anything, they say if you had African ancestry, even partially, meaning you looked to them like you were African, you were classified as black, regardless of how much native ancestry you had or how many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years your people had been here. At the same time, tribes were being terminated or detribalized if their members didn't meet the arbitrary purity standards. So if you didn't look Siberian, if you didn't look like what they said Indians look like, then you were detribalized. Then we had the paper genocide, which I've talked about. So many Native Americans across the East Coast, including the Nipmuc, the Lumbee, the Powhatan, the Catawba, the Wampanoag, and others were listed as, and you just heard this, freedman, free Negro, mulatto, or colored in all the official records. This was part of systemic campaign to eliminate tribes on paper. This is known as a paper genocide. Again, harken back to as the numbers of Native Americans were going down by the hundreds of thousands, the number of enslaved Africans was going up by the hundreds of thousands. Because remember, classifying somebody as black meant they were now seen as part of the racial underclass rather than a sovereign nation, and they were available to be enslaved. So here's some examples from some other tribes. Virginia passed the 1924 Racial Integrity Act, which said if you weren't 100% white, you were colored, even if your family had been known as Indian for centuries. So you're just either white or colored in Virginia in 1924. However, unless you're rich, because they had the Pocahontas exception, and it was created to protect elite white Virginians with known Native ancestry. They're protected with the Pocahontas exception. Everybody else, you're colored. The Lumbee of North Carolina were denied federal recognition partly because too many were Black, either Negro or colored or mulatto, on their old records. So you can't be Native because on a piece of paper, somebody said you weren't. So the bottom line, the reclassification of the Nipmuc from Indian to colored to Negro was not just an administrative update, okay? It was a form of cultural genocide and racial warfare. You're seeing the picture. These people were and still are indigenous, still spiritually and culturally tied to their land, still maintaining the oral histories and the traditions. Cutting Up with Joan just says the lighter skinned members of our tribe for some Cape Verde heritage. Cynical, my father is Seminole, which is Yamasee, and my mother's Kickapoo. Isn't that awesome? I just think that's amazing. It almost makes me want to cry that you guys are having these conversations. Okay, to the state, the Nipmuc were no longer Indian. That was the point, right? They couldn't have been listed. And here's the thing, listen to me when I say this. They couldn't have been listed as free Negro, mulatto, colored in official records unless they looked Black. They were phenotypically Black, okay? So this sort of proves that there were Black tribes here. These reclassified Native tribes didn't just intermarry with Africans. There weren't Africans all over the continent. Many of them were already phenotypically Black because many of them were Black. Afro-Indigenous, Aboriginal, copper-skinned, wool-haired, indigenous to the land, and phenotypically African. Because when everybody came out of Africa, some people retained it. Okay? The Nipmuc, like the Pequot, the Wampanoag, the Powhatan, the Narragansett, and the Lumbee, weren't all mixed with African. That's the colonizers' framing, again, because they can't tell the difference. Many were already dark-skinned with tightly coiled hair long before slavery and mixing occurred. When census takers saw a dark-skinned person with African features, they didn't ask the person, are you a descendant of the first people of this land? They asked, are you Negro or mulatto? And when the person replied, I'm an Indian, it didn't matter. Of course, they would say what tribe they are, right? They were visibly Black to the census taker. And that's all the state needed to erase their tribal status and say this person is available for labor. This wasn't confusion, right? It was strategy. The government used phenotype as policy. If you looked Black, you were Black. That meant no tribal lands, no sovereignty, no recognition, and no legal standing. Here's some more. There's the Nipmuc. Some more Nipmuc, by the way. I didn't show it, but got to show some more. It meant no tribal land rights, no sovereignty, no recognition, and no legal standing, and you were open to being enslaved as ordained by the government, by the church, by the Pope, and to them, by God. And it created a deliberate fog and confusion where Black Indians were cast as Black. Negroes who still practiced indigenous religion or farming were called pagans, primitive, and superstitious. Entire indigenous nations were legally vanished just because they looked African. The erased tribes were often Black tribes. When we look at who was erased, they didn't just intermarry with Africans during slavery. They were the Black indigenous. They were the Africans who were here long before 1492. They were the indigenous. They had merged into indigenous communities and formed new nations sometimes. The visual evidence of their Blackness was the one and only excuse needed for the erasure. It wasn't the result of it. Let me look at some more comments. Maggie, this is why I argue with my hard-headed brothers from from there about patriarchy and solo father's surname. We always needed both mother and father's surname, just like the natives, right? So, do you guys want to go really deep? Do you want to get weird? How far in are we? Let's see. We're an hour in. We probably got another hour to go. Let's do it. Let's do it. And shout out to the replay gang. Let's do it. I have a whole other stack of notes here for a tinfoil hat time. So let's do it.
Tin for hat, time for awareness, time for awareness, time for less in the thoughts. Tin for hat, time for awareness, time for awareness, time for CIA and Kelpro, CIA it's a pro. Secrets not supposed to know. Tartaria, vanished land. MK Ultra minds and trends. Iran Contra, secret dance. Tin for hat. Time for ways, time for ways. Time for this in the thoughts. Tin for hat. That roll like Indians, they don't extol hidden history in this sky. Truth is hidden from your eyes. Whisper child fact alone. They can't gaslight no. Time for this. Time for this. Time for this. Tin for hat, time for wins, time for wins, time for this, time making a cat. Tin for your tin for tapes that roll like cock in the travel fact, oh Lord, they can't gaslight no more. Tin for pass in a cab. For wins, time for this, time for this, time making a cab.
I love it. I worked hard on that. I hope you guys liked it. But that gives me a little break in between. And it's fun. And you guys get to meet Wyatt, the bear, when I chose the bear. So let's get weird. Let's talk about Tartaria. Have you guys heard of Tartaria? Yeah, Spain Man. It was the remix. So, what mainstream academia will tell you is that the term Tartaria was a placeholder for unexplored lands, that it was a term just for barbarians or pagans or tribally scattered people. The official description of Tartaria is the Tartarian Empire is a collection of pseudo historical conspiracies positing the existence of a highly advanced global civilization often called Tartaria, which allegedly controlled vast regions of what Europe historically labeled Tartary, and what they say is Central and Inner Asia, and extended into North America and Europe. That is the official description of Tartaria. What did Leanne say? Maggie, a little tinfoil hat. Why are Europeans in Europe more likely to be vitamin D deficient compared to American whites? This might go over some people's head. I don't think most people are deficient. Who was the group that first measured? And you know what's interesting is if you watch my show on the 2 different shades of pale, there's one pale that has melanin deposits, or what we would call freckles, right? Definitely. Okay, so let's talk legal recognition and cartographic detail. So cartography was where people made maps. So this is pre-1800. Okay, again, academia and the government will tell you that Tartaria is just a generic term for unexplored lands, not a real people. And there's a few problems with that explanation. Pre-1800 diplomas and marriage certificates have Tartaria listed as people's nationality. Yes, lots of those exist. They are physical, dated, legal documents that predate the supposed end of Tartaria or these unexplored lands. These prove that Tartaria was recognized as a legitimate geopolitical entity by Western institutions. A key point here is that official seals, notarizations, and signatures show Tartaria was not a myth or a legend or an unexplored land or a conspiracy, but something a person could be legally affiliated with in Europe. If Tartaria was only a generic region, it would not appear on personal legal documents. Legal bureaucracy requires specific political national designations. So this supports the position that it was a real recognized empire, not some vague term. Mainstream history tries to have it both ways, okay? Because they'll have Tartary referred to the people of Central Asia, the Tatars, not with an R, Tatars, right? The Mongols, etc. And Tartary was also a vast, mostly unexplored landmass. Well, which one is it? It's logically inconsistent. If it was unexplored, how could they have already assigned it to a specific peoples, the Tartars or the Tatars? If it was explored enough to name its people and produce detailed maps, it was not unknown. Because again, these maps are very detailed, right? It's a dual use, which is a red flag. It signals a transition in the narrative. Interestingly enough, one definition is likely being erased and being replaced by the other during the rewriting of history. And there's a reason why, and it has to do with Putin. But we'll talk about him in a minute. There's a map accuracy problem, okay? Many of the maps in question, again, are extremely detailed. There are river systems, cities, topography, and coastlines are laid out with very detailed precision. That means that someone explored and documented these regions extensively. If Tartaria was truly some blank space on the European mental map, we would expect cartographic inaccuracy. So distorted coastlines, missing interior details, or generalized labels like, here be dragons, right? Instead, we have maps that name specific cities They show trade routes. They mark fortifications and ports. Hmm. Hmm. Ports. This level of accuracy only comes from sustained contact, from trade, from governance. It is direct evidence that Tartaria was not some mystery zone. The contradictions force a choice. Okay, option A. Option A. Tartaria was truly unknown, and the maps would be crude, speculative, and sparsely labeled. Or option B, Tartaria was known and documented, and maps were accurate because the empire existed and was politically recognized. Since the maps are highly accurate and official documents name Tartaria, option B is the only one that fits the evidence. So this means that Tartaria was an empire of peoples and territories that Europe interacted with directly. Oh, we got a sidebar. Any group of people named taters are already my favorite folks, just saying. Who out there belongs to the steak people? Okay. If why all this matters in the context of Black civilization erasure? Why does this matter? If, as a lot of people claim, Tartaria was indeed a Black or a Moorish-led empire, as people like Charles Formosa and other people's claim, its erasure fits the exact same pattern as the Garifuna, the Maya, the removal of Black pharaohs from Egyptian history, the paper genocide of Black indigenous Americas. Once erased, the name Tartary could be downgraded to mean vague Asia, unexplored lands, removing all memory of its advanced civilization, racial identity, and technological capabilities. This is how an empire gets disappeared in plain sight. Its name lingers on maps long enough to be harmless, but its meaning is altered beyond recognition. Go on. Sorry, dog. Now, let's talk Putin. What does Putin have to do with this? And Leon brought it up. 1 year from now, Putin will start snitching on conversations and knowledge that America has no control over anymore. I have to send you the video of British elites making arguments against reparations. Adrian says, gee, where did all the Mayans go? Who are the Mayans? Right? That's a fairy tale. So what does Putin have to do with this? Okay. Well, he knows what Tartaria was. In fact, a lot of what is now Russia was part of the Tartarian Empire. Putin threatened Biden and told him he would release documents about the real, he called it the real Tartaria, that he would release it to who? United States citizens. This was at the same time that he released all the Black religious iconography. And we remember that. And guess what? The stuff that Russia has on Tartaria is juicy, but you can't find the threat he made on the web anymore. Now, other people might be able to. With all the different things I've tried, even a different VPN, I can't find it. But what I can find is a whole bunch of people responding to the threat. So the threat happened. So let's talk about what Russia knows about Tartaria. In 1957, there's a 1957 CIA document, later declassified, which references a Soviet Central Committee directive. So this references a declassified Russian document dated August 9th, 1944, instructing the Tartar Provincial Committee. So in the USSR, they had a Tartar Provincial Committee. And they said, quote, to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character, end quote. The directive reveals Soviet efforts to shape historical narratives in regions with Tartaria majority populations. You can get the CIA document from the CIA reading room, okay? And it's titled National Cultural Development Under Communism. It's in there. But again, Europe will try to tell you Tartaria was just it's just Asia, or it's just unexplored lands. Then why did Russia have a committee on it and say, let's rewrite history? While Soviet-era operational files are kind of sparse on the trade specifics with Tartaria, older commercial accounts describe active trade between Russia and regions identified as Tartary or Tartaria. One notable example in the late 18th to the early 19th centuries, the 1700s, Tartarian rhubarb, that's what it's still called, by the way, was brought to Russian markets via Kyakhta. And it was exchanged for Russian furs under state-controlled contracts. So these are state contracts to trade rhubarb that comes from Tartaria for Russian furs. This transaction involved merchants from Bukhara and Lesser Bukharia, which are today parts of Xinjiang and Kashgar region, supplying rhubarb to Russian officials. Okay. The reference for that is the website mirror.csclub.uwaterloo.ca. Again, you have to get a lot of European links for this because you can't find it in America. This illustrates documented economic networks linking Muscovy, Moscow, and the broader Eurasian steppe zones labeled as Tartary. Yes, Leon, and I was thinking about the Prussians when we were talking about this. Leon says Putin can open up his 50-mile-long bunker, aka the religious black scriptures and pictures. Yeah. But he released the religious iconography when he made that threat to Biden, which said, get off my hiney, or I'm going to tell all of your people exactly who the Tartarians are. Now, why would it be important to tell United States citizens who the Tartarians are if it's just some random Asians? Why would they care? Why would they care? Interesting. So the monograph Tartaria on the Great Silk Road by R.M. Valiv provides rigorous analysis of the trade dynamics between the Volga-Ural Bulgaria, the Golden Horde, and the neighboring Muslim and Chinese regions. Now, what is it called again, the book? Tartaria on the Silk Road, intersecting with Russian expansion. It examines coinage, goods movement, monetary weights, and merchant networks. You can read the book. It will tell you. And this is a diverse peoples. The Tartarians were diverse. Historical surveys like Whitson's Nord and Oas Tartary from 1690 systematically documents the Siberian trade routes, the political geography, and economic contacts involving Muscovy, Moscow, Central Asia, and Persia. I'm going to show you a little video. Let me take this off.
Remember back in the 1930s when archaeologists found an Egyptian temple buried in eastern Tennessee? That's okay, not a lot of people do. But back in 1934, they were building something called Norris Dam, just north of Knoxville, Tennessee. The Tennessee Valley Authority started surveying the valley that the Norris Dam was going to flood. They found many native mounds and started excavating a bit, and found some really extraordinary things. As they started digging, they found layer after layer, and went down over 20 foot until they found a 100-foot by 100-foot platform with a large raised area in the center. They called this a temple. As they dug deeper and deeper, they found multiple skeletons on the site, unlike any that they'd found in the area. And the site itself kept getting deeper and deeper. It appeared to just keep going. At the time, it caused quite an uproar, and over 400 workers were excavating that site. They found multiple relics that were unlike anything they had seen in the area, including a pigment box that held a shade of purple that could only be found in sea mollusks and was completely unknown in North America. The site gained the attention of James Randall Harris, a professor of ancient languages from Cambridge and later Johns Hopkins University. Harris came up with some very interesting conclusions. And I quote, "The Hopewell," he writes, "were latecomers who raised the mounds of earth over a much older temple built by pharaonic Egyptian emigres to the most important deities, Isis, the Queen of Heaven, and her husband, Osiris, the god of resurrection." That area has some very interesting correspondences with legends from the Cherokee. The Cherokee have legends about a group of priesthood that lived in their area called the Anikutani. This priesthood was wiped out. Now I'm going to read this directly from a historical source so you know it's not my words. Quote, from Cherokee Principal Chief Charles Hicks in 1826 in his manuscript, The History of the Cherokee People, the mound builders were greatly weakened by a plague. We entered the North Carolina mountains from the west, and we killed and drove off the mound builders. We burned their temples atop the mounds and then constructed our towns and houses on the mounds. The Cherokee never built any mounds. Further on, quote, the Anikutani profess themselves, as stated by the traditioners, to be the teachers of heavenly knowledge from the creation, and the manner of their introduction to the assembled people is usually at night. And they usually came with the words, I am from above. These tales all come from the area of eastern Tennessee, right where that temple is, and that temple is now under a lake.
Boy, that happens a lot, doesn't it? That things get put under a lake. But these were literally, this is the Cherokee people talking about that long before they were there were Egyptian Black immigrants who were in that region. And the Cherokee took them out, by the way. They said, nah, you don't need to be here anymore. Interesting, huh? So Adrian says, tinfoil hat with sugar on top. Is there any tie-in with the body snatchers in that same region? You know, the ones with the catacombs. So interestingly enough, where the tie-in happens with the catacombs is everywhere that colonizers went, they always built their church on top of ancient burial grounds, on top of catacombs. And then they installed organs, music organs that reverberated through the bones in the catacombs. Weird. I think there is a connection with the Tartarian Empire being in the Silk Road along with the body snatchers, or identity stealers, as I have referred to them before. And it's possible that they didn't get along, and maybe that's why they helped with the erasure of the Tartarians. Possibly. Okay, so let me get back to where I need to be. Okay, so one thing I want to bring up, though, while we're here is that modern academia will tell you there's no credible evidence that Tartarians were Black, while also telling you Tartaria didn't exist. But if it did, they were white, is what they will say. Now, as we all know, white is not a historical or global default. Defaulting to whiteness in art, history, or ethnography in itself is a political act, often tied to colonial, Eurocentric, and academic frameworks. We need to work with this framework honestly. Now, other people, like Charles Formosa, will show you evidence that the Tartarians were Black. So, there is no unambiguous white Tartarian iconography either. Now, interestingly enough, you can see here there is a flag for Tartary. How is there a flag? And the interesting thing is, if you look at the flag for Tartary, which is also very similar to the Welsh flag, and compare it to the Russian flag in the bottom corner, you will see that on the Russian flag, the Russian has the Tartarian griffin under his boots. Historical maps, paintings, and travel accounts often depict the people of Tartary with stylized, generalized features, but rarely with clear European or sub-Saharan African or even Middle Eastern detail. They often appear dressed in orientalized robes, Mongol-style clothing, with ambiguous dark or light Asian kind of facial features. They are rendered in ways that reflected the imagination or the biases of the European artist who just thought these were all Asian people long after they existed, not actual observations. So whiteness isn't depicted either, but it's been assumed that as a default, and that assumption is not neutral. All right, so historically, Black civilizations were way more widespread than acknowledged. Across Eurasia and Africa, Black or African featured populations were historically present in southern India and Sri Lanka. That was the Dravidian groups. Arabia and the Levant, right? We have the Nabateans, the Himyarites, and the Afro-Arabs. China's Tang dynasty had Black soldiers and merchants, which was documented. The steppes and the Caucasus, where the body snatchers were, they called them dark-skinned Scythians, right? Herodotus called them that. The Moors in Spain and North Africa, Ethiopia's far-reaching Christian and commercial networks, Sudanese, Nubian, and Sahelian kingdoms with transcontinental reach. So it's both historically reasonable and anti-colonizer to at least question whether Tartaria could have been included or ever been dominated by Black people, especially if the history was later rewritten. The 1944 Soviet directive said to rewrite it. European maps deliberately generalized and obscured detail. Colonialism erased or recoded all of the darker populations. So defaulting to Black as the original human image is more grounded in evolutionary and geographic reality. Modern genetics confirm humans descend from Africa. Dark skin is the original default ancestral trait. White or light skin is a localized adaptation, never a human default. Therefore, if we're talking about a pre-colonial, global, or advanced civilization, the likelihood of its members being melanated or being ruled by Black people is greater than not, especially in sun-rich, land-connected regions like Central Asia, North Africa, and West Asia. All of the lands that I just talked about is supposedly where the Tartarian Empire was. So challenging the white default in Tartaria discourse isn't just reasonable, it is necessary. If history was rewritten to erase the contributions of Black and Indigenous peoples, then restoring those identities isn't race baiting, it is correcting the record. That doesn't mean we assert specifics without evidence. Because remember, we talked about the diversity of the lands. This was an empire that was very diverse, but ruled by Black people. So we're not going to talk without evidence, but we will start with the global majority as being plausible. We will interpret any blank spaces with awareness of colonial erasure. If it's blank, they probably erased it. And we don't default to whiteness in the absence of any other proof. So I've talked about several areas here, right? But just how big was this Tartarian empire? So, the full historical scope of Tartary. We had Russian Tartary, which was covering much of Siberia, Russia east of the Urals, and up to the Arctic Ocean. Then we had Greater Tartary, which was a term for the vast territories in northern and central Asia, including parts of Kazakhstan and Mongolia, and even into Western China. All areas where we know there are Black people. Chinese Tartary is Manchuria and parts of interior China before the Qing consolidation. Then there's independent Tartary, which is around the Caspian Sea, like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. Who are these words? Then there was American Tartary. Yes, this appears in 17th to 18th century maps, so the 1600s, where parts of North America, particularly the inner West, now remember where the Californians are, which was so all of it near the Rockies from Alaska on down, are labeled as Tartaria or Tartar lands. Then we have Tartaria Europa, which older maps describe southern Russia, Crimea, and Ukraine as European Tartary. Oops, wrong way. So let's talk some more. We have Moorish and Sudano-Sahelian echoes in Tartary architecture. Fortresses in the Caucasus and Ural regions, which was Tartary, sometimes use mud brick, courtyard-centered designs similar to the Jen and in Timbuktu. They had domed structures, niches, and mathematical tile geometry, which shows up in Tartar mosques and even Siberian Buddhist temples. This is a synthesis. And where have we seen the bricked courtyard-centered structures before? Well, we have ancient circular stone architecture, which is a global pattern with African roots. We have the Natufian culture, which is like 12,000 BC, right, in the Levant and Northeast Africa. They were Black, by the way. The Natufians were Afro-Asiatic peoples who lived in what is now Israel, in Palestine, Jordan, and Syria, and possibly some into Egypt and the Sudan. They built semi-subterranean circular stone houses. The oldest known villages are Natufian. Innovations in architecture preceded Mesopotamia and prefigure structures in Jericho and Anatolia. These were dark-skinned, it's proven by DNA. This is anthropological, slow down, reconstructions. And they set the stage for agriculture, metallurgy, and cosmology in the entire ancient world. Now, going outward, structures showing shared design DNA, so circular plans, astronomical alignment, mortarless masonry, etc., appear across the globe, often near older African trade or migration routes. So in the Sahel and West Africa, we have the Senegambian stone circles. I'm not going to try to pronounce that town name. Sine and then Ngaye with an accent Ne. Then we have Tichitwalata in Mauritania, which is early stone towns with granaries and water management. We have Nubia, Ethiopia. We have Kerma culture, the early domed and stone dwellings. We have the Caucasus and Tartary, the Cyclopean stone walls, beehive domes, and round keep towers, especially in Ingushetia and Dagestan. In Central Asia, we have what they call the Tartar fortresses with rounded towers and earth-based domes. In Ireland and Britain, we have the brocks, the circular huts, and the stone circles with no European precursor. In the Andes and in Mesoamerica, we have circular temples in Ecuador and Peru, pre-Incan. And in North America, we have serpent mounds in Ohio. We have medicine wheels everywhere. We have earthwork circles, and we have mounds all across North America. Now, this sounds Moorish to me, and I'll tell you why. Moorish architecture in the Maghreb and the El Andalus is fundamentally rooted in North African Berber, Amazigh, I can't pronounce that either, traditions, combined with Islamic, Roman, and Afro-Asiatic influences. Fortified earthen granaries, courtyard houses. Now, courtyards, domes, and circular structures are all what tie all these together. They had kasbahs, which had mud brick and rammed earth, and it's from ancient African construction modes. Spanish Islamic architecture codified circular, courtyard-oriented, geometrically ordered spaces under water, shade, and calm, inheriting the symbolic memory of the Natufian and Sahel building system. The 1838 Architectural Dictionary describing Tartarian and Moorish architecture interchangeably. In 1838, it was the same architecture. But wait, Tartary didn't exist. How did they have architecture? I don't know, but it's Moorish. Tartarian and Moorish architecture was used interchangeably. It demonstrates that Western observers once recognized the stylistic lineage, even though it was erased afterward. So, what's the link to Tartarian architecture now? It's the circular forms. Across Central Asia, the Caucasus, and even Siberia, architectural forms include round tower foundations, circular citadels, beehive structures, and fortified domes seen in Ingushetia, Dagestan, and what they call Tartar fortresses. These echo Natufian-inspired circular prototypes more than later imperial abstractions. Oh, Qing. Okay, Adrian says it was pronounced Qing. Thank you. Yes, there is the architecture in Florida. It's actually across everywhere that they say Tartaria was, you can find this exact architecture. Okay, so for instance, we have the round city of Baghdad, which was supposedly built in 762 CE. It was built in a perfect circle with concentric layers of walls and towers, reflecting a continuity of circular planning, even in empire capitals. We have Hatra, which is a Parthian era city in Iraq, which Mesopotamia, Sumeria, by the way. They had radial layouts with central temples and circular fortifications, paralleling the defensive geometry seen across Eurasia. We have the Samanid Mausoleum in Bukhara from supposedly the 800s, which shows fortified corners around a cubic form, but stands on the central plan design inherited from the Sogdian and the Sassanian, who used circles, and possibly ancient African systems, which were rooted in the Natufian pattern of having a central focus. These forms align with all of the Moorish spatial concepts, the central domed environments, the symmetrical geometric structure, the enclosure with reflection. And I just want to end with this note, okay? Deuteronomy, and you know I don't like to quote the Bible unless I need to, but Deuteronomy 28:68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. What does Egypt mean? Slavery. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies, for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Who was sold into slavery again? By ships. Who was sold into slavery the first time? We've talked about this in what we call Egypt. That was Kemet. Egypt meant slavery. So the first time was in Kemet, who was sold again by ships, and who was the enemy. I want you to think about that. West African prophetic movements, especially among the Akan, the Yui, and the Yoruba descended communities, claim the people stolen and scattered during slavery were the children of Israel. A day of awakening would come when these people realized their true identity, and upon that awakening, divine justice would restore them to leadership and spiritual authority, restore them to global leadership. This is why I connect them with Tartary, not just the Moorish architecture, not just everywhere we find Black Indigenous people, but that as well. These traditions align with the Black Hebrew Israelite teachings in America, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa. The rise of movements like the Nation of Yahweh, the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, and Ghanaian religious sects emphasize all of this Hebrew ancestry. So, what if the stories we've been told only scratch the surface of what the truth is? What if the scattered tribes were not forgotten, but somehow they are the chosen? From ancient stone circles to mud brick fortresses, from Moorish arches to Nubian metallurgy, from Ashanti wisdom to Ghanaian prophecy, the truth never disappears, just waits. The maps called it Tartaria. The scriptures called the people Hebrew, and the truth is, it's both. I'm going to play you one more video.
Just met you brought me that album of Sioux music, Sioux Indian music. I'd like to know how interested you are in Indians, and are you interested in quotes, the Red Revolution and power for the Red Indian, that kind of thing. Are you interested? Yeah. What are American people doing for Indians? That's a big question over in Europe.
Yeah, I'm getting more and more interested in that. First, I was just interested in Indians like a kid at the cowboy movies. And that's how it started. And then I come from the Midwest where there are Indians everywhere. Yeah. But I mean, I used to see some as a kid. Yeah. And then, I don't know, I guess you just develop a feeling that's so tragic, that whole period of My Lai-like incidents, the Sand Creek Massacre, the Custer's wiping out of the Indians at
I just heard something very interesting on the what are those Indians down, the Incas and those other ones that could write?
Well, Aztecs and
the Mayans.
Oh, the Mayans, yeah.
I was reading, somebody on TV was talking about how when the Spanish came, these priests burned for 30 days all the Mayan books. So there was none left, and his reason was, it's either the word of God, and we've already got that, so we'll destroy it, and if it isn't, it's the work of the devil. So they destroyed the whole Mayan culture, literature, which was very good and very aware, and there was about 3 books left which sort of say, got up and went to work, and there's not enough words for them to work out what the language was.
That's right,
and
this one man destroyed a whole
written for Christianity.
Culture.
Yeah.
Also, the man who led the Indians who led the cavalry against the Indians at the Sand Creek Massacre was a man of the cloth.
Oh yeah.
Not that all.
You had an interesting Indian on your show you were telling me about too.
I have. I had a man who was also a great authority on Indians.
He was at Custer's Last Stand or something.
No, he was a friend of Curly, who was Custer's scout down Nightheart.
You didn't know he was an Indian freak, did you? So
but
what
the
about
thing
the
is
Red
that you
Revolution
feel like
then?
Maybe you could.
What's going to happen?
You feel so frustrated at what was done to the Indians in the past that you feel like you should do something for their descendants now, who are still getting it six ways.
Illiterate and not educated, not looked after. I mean, they're like, I don't know if they're having it worse than black people here, but it's pretty rough for them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very bad, and I think it's good that people have a sense of conscience about it and are doing something about it.
Well, they made so much money out of the Indians. At first they took the land, and then they made movies about them taking the land, Yeah. It's a bit mean, But we always used to stick up for the Indians in Britain on the movies,
I heard that in one movie they were making in which they did the Custer battle, which has never been done well on the screen, but anyway, they used the Crows as the ones who attacked Custer, whereas actually the Crows were the scouts for Custer.
Oh, I see.
And the Sioux, who were working on the picture, were furious. and said if it hadn't been for us, there wouldn't have been any Custer battle.
Well, it's like
You
Nixon
should
having a
use
Japanese
the
watch,
suit.
isn't it?
Having a what?
Japanese watch, you know.
Does he have a Japanese watch?
He does, yeah, with a Spiro Agnew watch. Yes, Japanese.
I didn't realize
But
that.
what's happening with the Indian? I mean, what are they doing for them, you know? Don't they
Not
legally
enough.
really own the land?
Not
like
enough.
Manhattan and that?
Interestingly enough, some conservative politicians seem to be more concerned for the Indians than some liberal
Maybe
politicians.
they've
which
realized
is
how many
interesting.
there are on the whole
many?
American continent, including the South.
How many
People
votes
think
it
there's
means?
only a few Indians left. There's millions of them in the whole continent of America, which includes South America. And one day they're going to be asking for their rights. I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't standing next to the black people too. So it's either give now or die later.
Okay, I want to answer a couple questions. So Adrian says, Anatolia, is that where they invented bicepsing? Oh, you're talking about Anatoly. I had to think about it for a second. It's a content creator. Leon says, circular house, in my opinion, more mentally healthy than square houses that cause depression. This is just an opinion. Maggie's in the field to ask if squares cause any form of mental illness. Well, in thinking about this question, two things come to mind. One is feng shui, right? So in feng shui, when you have a corner, energy is trapped in the corner. You have to create flow in a home, right? You have to have all four environments in your home: fire, water, air. I just wanted to say earth, wind, and fire. And then you also have to have something that pulls energy from the sky. So that's why you'll see red strings that are attached. That's feng shui. But the other thing it made me think about is the lack of sunlight causes depression. Okay. Being vitamin D deficient, which, we were talking about, causes depression. And so being shut in a home causes depression because of the lack of sunlight. Yes, we have windows, but when you have those circular structures that are built around a central courtyard, then you have sunlight coming in at all times from both ways. And in that central courtyard is where the family and the people would gather, always in the air, getting fresh air and sunshine and things like that. And so it does seem to me that it would, be better for your mental health to be in these centralized structures. And even these bigger, where you look at the circular towns. So not only is each house centered around a center courtyard, each town is centered around a central courtyard. And so there's all this it's a lot of flow and coming together and being outside and all of those kind of things. So again, seems to me like it would be better for your mental health. Okay, I appreciate you guys being here. This was a long one. It's over 2 hours, and for me, that's a lot. But I hope to be incorporating more of the tinfoil hat stuff, especially so I can use the jingle, right? I made it. I want to use it. So next Sunday, we're going to be talking about how in the biblical story of Moses, he was probably high. So we're going to be talking about that, which will include the acacia tree. So we'll be talking about that. But this Wednesday, we're going to continue with the Book of Knowledge, the Keys of Enoch. We are getting very deep into that. And almost every one of those looks like a tinfoil hat because of what I'm bringing into it. I believe this next one, we're going to be talking about cybernetics, Scientology, a whole bunch of stuff. So if I don't see you this Wednesday, I hope to see you next Sunday. And before I forget, I love you, I miss you, and you're my favorite. Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And don't forget to check out some of the wilder Pivot Point Wednesday shows. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not so teric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. By subscribing, you'll join a community that thrives on curiosity and growth, and you'll never miss out on insights and some wild discussions. Let's uncover the universe together. Bye.